dead of night on the mean streets of London's
Here we go.
impoverished East End. On one particular street, a man's horse suddenly rears up while pulling a cart. Something's frightened it. The guy then lights a match and makes a grisly discovery: the body of a woman with her throat sliced from ear to ear.
Ew.
What this man doesn't know is Jack the Ripper is hiding right next to him in the shadows. If he pricked his ears, he'd probably hear the Ripper's labored breathing, a consequence of just cutting that poor woman's neck. The Ripper should have been seen that night. He should have been caught. In fact, as you'll see in this show, it's frankly incomprehensible that he wasn't stopped in his tracks there and then. That man's name was Louis Diemschutz. We're going to come back to him and explain just how close he was to catching the Ripper. But first, let's give you a small introduction to possibly the world's most famous serial killer.
I've
One of the
never,
reasons it was
I might have
difficult
heard
to
of this
catch the
guy.
man was the fact that those London streets in the 1880s were a giant labyrinth that were hardly well lit. Some of the slum areas were ripe for murder at night. Seeing that prostitutes wandered around by themselves in the dark looking for gin-addicted clients. The area of Whitechapel, where the Ripper committed his ghastly crimes, was heaving in those days with people
Oh,
living
so
in
this is
abject
London.
poverty. When folks couldn't get any work, some of them turned to crime. Many of the women turned to what's sometimes called the oldest trade in the world. In fact, in 1880, there were a total of 62 brothels and 1,200 prostitutes in this area alone. Some of these women lived in the lodging houses. These were about the cheapest places you could live. Some of the rooms even had a rope you could lean on as a form of bed. This was where we get the term hangover, because people would literally hang over a rope. The rope cost 2 pence a night, and while uncomfortable, it was better than the street and all the dangers that lurked there.
can
This was a
sleep on
kind
a
of place
rope?
where Jack the Ripper made his name. It was a cauldron of violence, vice, racism, and some say immorality. In other words, it was an ideal place to kill people because the police can sometimes be less than caring about the victims of this so-called lower class. But once the Ripper got going, he was hard to ignore. That was because of the extreme nature of his crimes. It's thought he killed 5 people for sure, called the Canonical Five, but he might have murdered as many as 11. For instance,
Dang.
no one's certain if he killed Emma Elizabeth Smith. She'd fallen on hard times and became a prostitute, with a detective later writing about her. There was something about Emma Smith which suggested that there had been a time when the comforts of life had not been denied to her. There was a touch of culture in her speech, unusual in her class. In the wee hours of April 3rd, 1888, she was savagely attacked. She didn't die instantly but went into a coma and died shortly after. Was this the work of the Ripper? It's hard to know. She wasn't mutilated like many of the later victims, but her injuries were horrifying nonetheless. Then there was Martha Tabram, an alcoholic
Ew.
who had a reputation for staying out all night and causing general havoc. On August 6, 1888, she and
I
some
still
other
think he's
women
a
went to the
vampire?
Angel and
Why?
Crown pub, and as the expression goes, got hammered. She was later found dead, again with horrifying injuries. Those included being stabbed in her heart and lungs. The killer also stabbed her 9 times in the throat. The term overkill was suitable
In the
here, with 39
throat?
stab wounds on her body in total. Detective Edmund Reed was on the case. A mysterious man had been seen that night close to where the victim was found, so he put a bunch of men in the lineup. Nothing came of it. There's a slim
Good,
chance
Sully.
it could have been the work of the Ripper, and if it was, he was close to being caught that night, although he came a hell of a lot closer, as you'll soon see. One of the reasons this woman is said to have been the victim of possibly a different killer is the fact that she wasn't skillfully mutilated, and she hadn't been eviscerated. The murder weapon used to kill her was also cruder than the one the Ripper used. Now we come to the first victim who was included in the Canonical Five. She was Marianne Nichols, known as Polly to her friends. She was killed August 31st that same year. Yeah, that is a short time after the last murder, but as we said, those London slums were terrible places to live
When's The
back
Last of
then,
Us? 10 minutes.
So it's possible there were a few men who killed women in the East End in those months. The MOs might have been similar to the murders, but the Ripper had quite a unique signature. That's why you're watching the video about him right now. It was his method of killing that made headlines all over the world, not just the fact that he killed. Killers were two a penny, but skilled mutilators were not. Polly also had a tough life, at times getting money from rent, by working in one of London's brutal workhouses, and other times by selling her body. On the night of August 30th, she went to the Frying Pan pub and had some drinks. It seems she might have spent all her cash, because later she was chucked out of her lodging house for not being able to pay the rent.
Oh,
She
shit.
looked at the landlord that night and said, "I'll soon get my DOS money. See what a jolly bonnet I've got now." Maybe she thought her new bonnet would help her find a client or two, and so she'd have a bed that night. Early in the
This
morning,
makes me wanna
she
watch
was seen
Vampire
staggering
Diaries.
around,
Vampire Diaries
drunk
is
as hell.
fire.
Slurring her words, she said to an acquaintance, "I've had my lodging money 3 times today and I've spent it." Those were the last words anyone ever heard from Polly. Charles Allen Cross was the man that found her body at 3:40 a.m. What's amazing is that when Cross found her, she'd likely only been dead for about 10 minutes. The Ripper couldn't have gotten far in that time. In fact, cops interrogated 3 horse slaughterers. They were Harry Tompkins, James Munford, and Charles Britton. They'd been close to the scene of the crime when it happened. As we said, the killer had to be nearby. Someone had to have seen something. The cops were also taken aback by the sheer brutality of the murder. The woman had not only had her throat cut, but her abdomen had been mutilated, so much so her insides were spilling out. A 6 to 8 inch knife had been used, possibly a shoemaker's knife, and it seemed to medical experts that some anatomical skill had been employed in the murder. There were so many injuries to Polly that the police determined that the killer must have been working on her for a full 5 minutes, and this was out in the open. Also, on his escape, the killer would have had some blood on him. Was this man invisible or something? Surely someone had to have seen something. Upon investigation, this is what the coroner had to say about that. It seems astonishing, at first thought, that the culprit should have escaped detection, for there must surely have been marks of blood about this person. Still, he said that with there being so many slaughterhouses in the area, a man had been walking around with blood-stained clothes, maybe onlookers would have thought nothing of it. Now, there had been 3 brutal murders, although police couldn't say if they'd been committed by the same person. It was at this time that London's infamous press got to work, which fomented chaos in the city. Nowhere seemed safe. Then on September 8th, there was the grisly discovery of Annie Chapman. Her life was also a tale of woe. She had a problem with booze, which worsened after her daughter died, and she had to place her disabled son in care. Then her husband split with her and took the last child, and she ended up living in one of those run-down Whitechapel lodging houses. After her husband died from his alcoholism, the little bit of cash he sent her was gone. She made money by doing odd jobs after that, but also prostituted herself when things got desperate. At 5:15 a.m. that morning, a man heard a woman scream when he was walking along Hanbury Street. He didn't bother to investigate, and so yet again, the Ripper could have been caught if things had been a little different. She was found at 6 a.m. nearby and hadn't been dead long. This is what one of the doctors said in his report. The instrument used at the throat and abdomen was the same. It must have been a very sharp knife with a thin, narrow blade, and must have been at least 6 to 8 inches in length, probably longer. The injuries could have been done by such an instrument as a medical man used for post-mortem purposes.
That hurts
Those injuries
so badly.
matched the ones on Polly, with experts saying the killer must have had some anatomical knowledge due to the fact that in one movement, he'd taken out her reproductive organs. The press went crazy, making up stories that some guy nicknamed Leather Apron
Her
might have been to
reproductive
blame.
organs?
One report said, whatever information may be in the possession of the police, they deem it necessary to keep secret. It's believed their attention is particularly directed to a notorious character known as
Bro, he
Leather
cut
Apron.
out her
A man named
uterus?
John Pizer was arrested and interrogated. He was known as Leather Apron, and he had a history of violence, but in the end, he proved his innocence and even claimed some compensation from the newspapers that named and shamed him. It might not have been him, but whoever it was had committed the crime in a fairly busy area. Yet again, it seemed the culprit had a mask of invisibility, but in the next murder, he might have basically done the deed right under someone's nose. Louis Dimeshutz had spent the day of September 29th selling his cheap jewelry. At the end of the day, feeling tired, he took his horse and cart back to Dutsfield Yard. Little did he know that as he approached the yard, the Ripper was mutilating a woman named Elizabeth Stride. Again, her life was full of tragedy, a story including dying children and a dead husband. Her misfortune led to her working as a prostitute, or at least on the days she couldn't afford to pay for her room in the slum. Stride had been spotted about 11 p.m. that night with a man wearing a bowler hat. He was also said to have been well-dressed and sported a rather fetching black mustache. We may never know if he was the Ripper. At around 12:45 a.m., she was seen again with a man who was well-dressed. This was just after a policeman had seen her with a man wearing a hat, although he didn't describe it as being a bowler hat. Whoever the man was, Stride had apparently said to him, "No, not tonight, some other night." Just before 1 a.m., she was seen by at least 2 other people, and both times she was with the man. The Ripper was certainly a brazen killer, knowing he'd been seen with Stride, but he still carried the act through to its bloody end. It was at 1 a.m. when Dimeshutz's horse could be heard clip-clopping down the street. He later explained, "I left home about 11:30 in the morning and returned home at exactly 1 a.m. Sunday morning. I noticed the time at the tobacco shop in the commercial road. I was driving a pony harnessed to a costermonger's barrow. It was as he entered the yard that his pony stopped in its tracks, as if startled by something. Dimeshutz thought he could see something in the way, but with it being so dark, he had no idea what it was. That's when he pulled out some matches. Now, with the glow of the match, he pulled out his whip and nudged whatever it was on the floor. It was then that he realized it was a body, and noticing a dress, he knew it was a woman. What he didn't know was that she'd only just been killed. He actually thought at one point the body might be his wife. This was the East End. Coming across a passed-out person in the street who'd had one too many drinks was not unusual at all. Dimeshutz said so much in his statement, which read in part, "I took no further notice of it, but went into the club and asked where my missus was. I found her in the front room on the ground floor. I left the pony in the yard by itself just outside the club door. My wife was with several of the members of the club. I told them, there's a woman lying in the yard, but I cannot say whether she is drunk or dead. He subsequently left the scene, got himself a candle, and then returned to the body. It was then that he noticed all the blood. He then ran through the streets looking for a policeman, but unable to find one, he returned to the body with another man. Not one to understand much about contaminating a crime scene, he lifted up the woman's body. He saw that her throat had been cut from ear to ear. The actual autopsy report stated that Stride had not long before her death consumed some cheese and potatoes. It also said there was a clear-cut incision on the neck. It was 6 inches in length and commenced 2.5 inches in a straight line below the angle of the jaw, 3/4 of an inch over an undivided muscle, and then becoming deeper, dividing the sheath. The cut was very clean and deviated a little downwards. The arteries and other vessels contained in the sheath were all cut through.
I don't want to know this.
This time, though, he didn't remove any organs. Maybe he didn't have time. Several families lived in the area. Then even more people came forward and said they'd seen Stride either talking or arguing with a man. Another person said the man had a mustache. Not only that, but the International
gross.
Working Men's Educational Club, where Dime Shoots was a steward, was full of people singing and dancing. This place was right next to where the murder
Who's ready
had
for
taken
Last of
place.
Us, chat?
Had they not been singing,
Who's ready for
people would have
Last of
surely
Us?
heard Stride's screams through a window that was open. That's debatable though, seeing as the Ripper might have made his cut before she had a chance to scream. If he did commit this murder, he surely had a busy night. That's
What
because
video is
about
this? I
45
think it's like a
minutes later, not too
BuzzFeed
far away, he killed
Jack the Ripper
Catherine
video.
Eddowes. She had been slashed over the face
This is
and had
boring.
her throat cut. The autopsy
It's not the
report
most
said
entertaining
the
thing.
peritoneal lining was cut through on the left side and the left kidney
All right,
carefully taken out
1.5x
and
is how.
removed. I believe the perpetrator of the act must have had considerable knowledge of the position of the organs in the abdominal cavity and the way of removing them. Still, it's long been disputed if such work required the skill of a surgeon. Some thought no, but the killer might have worked as a
Not the
butcher.
blood-
It was
not the
certain
best
that all those
explanation.
mutilations
This
might
one's
have taken around
ass.
5 minutes. Another doctor testified that when he arrived at the scene, she'd only been dead for
Play
about 40
Detroit
minutes.
Become
It should
Human?
be
I've
said,
gotten
in
that
those
a
days, there
lot.
was a lot
People
of
want me to play
guesswork as
that.
compared to now, but still, doctors had a fairly good idea about the time of death in such cases. So the Ripper had committed 2 murders in a short space of time. He might have rushed the first one, seeing that he basically did it right under people's noses. Even with the second one, he could easily have been seen. That's when the killer really started to push his luck. He either began a correspondence with the police and press, or someone was playing a hoax.
There's a movie
After these
about
murders, a
him? What's it
postcard was sent
called?
to the cops, and so was the famous From Hell letter, accompanied with a kidney. Part of the letter read, "I send you half the kidney I took from one woman. Preserved it for you. The other piece I fried and ate. It was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out if you only wait a while longer. Signed, catch me when you can." It might have been a hoax, but at the same time, those missives made Jack the Ripper case explode.
It's
in
either
the
this or a
media.
2-hour
As you know,
video.
there were
No,
only
I
two
know.
more canonical victims, and there were perhaps some more victims too, but the Ripper really should have been caught the night he committed the double murder. As Dime Shoots later said, the Ripper must have committed the act only seconds before he arrived on the scene. He wrote, "It would have been quite possible for a man to have escaped from the yard while I was driving up to the club door, but after I had told the members what I had seen, nobody, I think, could have escaped." The cops speculated that the Ripper must have seen Dime Shoots approaching, and that's when he took evasive action. In fact, they said that when Dime Shoots lit that match, it's very likely the Ripper was standing nearby in the shadows. It must have been when Dime Shoots went to get that candle that he made the escape. Think about it, if Dime Shoots hadn't gone to get the candle and instead shouted something, all those people in the club would have come out and likely discovered the killer. The Ripper wouldn't have killed again, and the case would have quickly been written off as just another set of gruesome events in a place where people were used to that kind of thing. Now, you need to know more about Jack, and watch the most
The series is called Ripper Street.